In this next couple of videos, we're going to put forth a number of tools that you can use for analyzing arguments. And as we put forward these tools, we're going to apply them to various arguments to show how you can use them. So let's start at first principles with the question, why should we study an argument? Let's use this quote from Trudy Gavier's book, A Practical Guide to Argument, to answer this question. We evaluate arguments to reach opinions based on reasoned reflection and good judgment. We should seek well-founded and sensible opinions grounded in factual accuracy and coherent reasons. So that's what we're going to be doing in these next videos, making sure that arguments that we encounter are grounded in factual accuracy and have coherent reasons supporting them. So let's proceed by first determining how we can identify that an article that we're reading is actually is an argument. An argument will contain a series of premises and a conclusion. So let's know that we should look for these keywords to identify a premise or premises, and other keywords to identify that we are at the conclusion. So we've listed some common words that indicate that something is a premise. They are as indicated by, as shown by, because, it follows from, for the reason that is inferred from, given that, may be derived from, may be deduced from, on the grounds that, and some. So some of them are just single words: for, because, since, and then others are more formal phrases like as indicated by or as may be deduced from. So when you see these words, you know that you have a premise. Let's see which words usually introduce a conclusion. So we have a long list here again, highlighted by single words that are probably more commonly found: so, then, therefore, thus, and then the more formal ones that are probably seen less often, demonstrates that, for the reason we can see that, indicating that, it can be inferred that, it follows that, we can conclude or infer that. Also, single words that we would see sort of an intermediate level would be like accordingly, consequently, that sort of thing. So when we see these sets of words, these words indicating conclusion, or these words indicating premise, we probably know that what we're looking at, the article we're looking at, is argument. However, we do need to be aware of the fact that what we are looking at may be just an explanation. So let's contrast an explanation and an argument. In argument, we're going to have premise 1, premise 2, premise n, since we don't know how many premises we're going to have, and then therefore the conclusion. Whereas in an explanation, we're going to have, instead of premises, we're going to have something like factor 1, factor 2, factor n, therefore event X came to be. So an explanation is more like telling a story. Here's what happened, not I'm trying to convince you of something. So let's write on the next blackboard. So when we do have an argument, we will find that the speaker or the writer is claiming something, questions of justification are being considered, and that the article has a fundamental point, as contrasted with an explanation where we're just saying, here's why something occurred, or it might just be a story being told. Now that we know how to discern, how to identify that we do in fact have an argument, and how to identify the premises and the conclusions, let's look at the structure into which we would put an argument. So we've identified the premises, we've identified the conclusion. Let's see what an argument structure can look like. There's going to be more than one structure. So the most simple type of argument would have this structure: premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise n, since we don't want to designate exactly how, we don't know in this general structure exactly how many premises there are, and then therefore a conclusion. However, the way these premises point to the conclusion can be quite different. So let's look at a charting way to describe how an argument would be formed structurally. So here we have two premises and a conclusion, but the structure is that premise 1 implies premise 2, and then premise 2 implies our conclusion. This part of the argument here is going to be called a sub-argument. In this second argument structure, we also have a sub-argument. Here, though, the set of premises P1, P2, and P3 imply a new premise, and then that new premise P4 implies our conclusion P5. And then a third example, these are not all the types, of course, they're just example types. This would be a string of premises. So P1 implies, premise 1 implies premise 2 implies premise 3, and then that premise 3 implies our conclusion, which we're designating as C4. We want to look at one more type of argument structure, this one here. Here, premise 1 implies the conclusion, premise 2 implies the conclusion, and premise 3 implies the conclusion. This is called convergent support, and we could, the distinctive feature of this is if we removed this one premise 3, we would still have premise 1 and 2 supporting the argument. Of course, we could remove other premises and still have it supporting it. Whereas if we look at this structure here, this all three of these premises must be present for us to get the new premise from that premise 4. So this sub-argument right here has link support. We indicate that by the plus sign between P1, P2, and P3. So if we removed any one of these premises, if we found in looking more closely that any one of these premises were invalid, when we have link support, then premise 4 would not be valid and our conclusion would not be valid. So let's read through this argument and keep an ear open while you read it to see if you can determine where it may or may not be problematic. Don't take the advice of the nuclear establishment on the issue of nuclear safety. The people who make and run nuclear power plants have assured us that there will never be a major catastrophe, but manufacturers of nuclear reactors also make household appliances like toasters, dryers, and washers, which are not completely reliable, and so there's much less reason to believe nuclear reactors are reliable. Let's identify the premises and the conclusion of this. Conclusion is actually the first sentence. It's common when you see an argument, as we mentioned earlier, for the conclusion to not appear last. Here the conclusion, which is actually the fifth in the string of premises leading to conclusion, 4 premises and a conclusion, is right here. Don't take the advice of the nuclear establishment on the issue of nuclear safety. What are the premises? Premise 1, the manufacturers of nuclear reactors make household appliances like toasters, washers, and dryers. Premise 2 is in the same sentence. Washers, dryers, and toasters are not completely reliable. P4, nuclear reactors, or P3, are not likely to be reliable. And then there are some unstated premises. So let's go to the next blackboard to point out the premises and unstated premises. So as we go through the premises of these arguments, this argument, P1 is stated. Manufacturers of nuclear reactors make toasters, washers, and dryers. That's a premise we can accept. Toasters, washers, and dryers aren't completely reliable. Also a premise we can accept. Here's an implicit premise, or an unstated premise. Companies making unreliable simple products will make unreliable complex products. The argument is asking you to believe that, from which they infer nuclear reactors aren't likely reliable. As premise 4, unreliable nuclear reactors will cause much loss of life and property damage. That's a premise we can accept if it's warranted. And then the conclusion, don't take nuclear manufacturers' advice about the safety of their reactors. Let's point out the argument structure that we have here on the next blackboard. So it's premise 1, 2, and 3 taken together that yield premise 4. Premise 4 that nuclear reactors aren't reliable. Notice that if we remove this implicit premise, premise 3, we aren't able to get to P4. But if we could get to P4, that nuclear reactors aren't reliable, then of course there would be much loss of life and property damage if that was true, and we shouldn't take the advice of nuclear reactor manufacturers, as the article suggests would be true. So if we remove the unstated premise, premise 3, the argument falls apart, and so this is what we would consider to be a weak inductive argument. So we've taken a look at how to identify premises and conclusions, and the structure of arguments, and how to analyze arguments, and pick out the premises and conclusions, and look at least one example so far at looking at the validity of the argument. So let's conclude this video now and pick up on the next video other ways to look at arguments and determine whether they are acceptable or not.